Do you live in California, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Oakland, San Diego, Sacramento, or anywhere near the coastline that runs from the Mexican border up to the Oregon line? If the answer is yes, you need to watch this entire video, because while almost every camera and every headline on the planet was pointed at Japan this week, something else was happening quietly under your own feet, and most people never even heard about it. On Tuesday, July 28th, a magnitude 7. One earthquake tore through the Kumamoto region on the Japanese island of Kyushu. It struck in the late afternoon, and within seconds, a shopping mall partially collapsed with people still inside. Rescue crews spent days digging through concrete and steel searching for survivors. The death toll climbed fast, first to 18, then higher, and by the sixth day, officials in Kumamoto Prefecture were confirming at least 35, then 38 deaths, some from the quake itself, others from heat-related illness. Survivors were forced to sleep in their cars during a brutal heat wave with temperatures pushing 40 degrees Celsius. More than 60 people were injured, several critically. Satellite imagery later showed the ground itself had shifted, with visible displacement and elevation changes stretching across a 10-kilometer radius. Roads buckled. Overpasses cracked out of alignment. The Hayward Fault zone, a fault line running through Kyushu, appeared to have ruptured in a way that surprised even seismologists who have studied this region for decades. A tsunami warning was issued along parts of the Japanese coastline in the immediate aftermath, sending coastal residents scrambling toward higher ground in the middle of an already chaotic afternoon. In the days that followed, the aftershock sequence refused to calm down. A magnitude 6. 8 aftershock hit the same stretch of Kyushu, then a 5. 6, then a 5. 4, each one reopening cracks in buildings already weakened by the main shock, each one sending rescue crews back to recheck structures they had just finished searching. This was not the region's first reminder this year either. Back in April, a magnitude 7, 5 earthquakes struck off the Sanriku coast of Honshu, triggered by rupture along the Japan Trench, generating an 80-centimeter tsunami and damaging more than 230 structures across the Tohoku region. Japan has now recorded multiple magnitude 7 or larger earthquakes in 2026 alone, a pace that keeps its seismologists working overtime and keeps reminding the rest of the Ring of Fire exactly what kind of year this has been. That earthquake dominated global news for days, and it should have. But here's the problem. While the world was fixed on Kyushu, seismic instruments on the other side of the Pacific Ocean, in Northern California, were recording something of their own. On June 24th, a magnitude 5.6 earthquake struck near Redwood Valley in Northern California. It was strong enough to trigger California's ShakeAlert early warning system, sending alerts to phones across the region in the seconds before shaking arrived. That single event was just the beginning. Seismologists have now logged more than 230 earthquakes in the sequence that followed, a swarm that has continued for weeks, quietly building beneath a state that most Americans assume is stable, unless something makes the news. This next part matters, because California does not need a headline event to be dangerous. It needs almost no attention at all, because the danger is already built into the ground. As of this year, California has recorded roughly 500 earthquakes of magnitude 2, 5 or higher, and in just the past 30 days alone, Seismic Networks logged 49 separate earthquakes across the state, with the strongest reaching magnitude 4. 3 near Johannesburg, out in Kern County. In the 24 hours before this video was written, dozens more small tremors rattled the ground from the Mexican border near Baja California, up through the Central Valley, past towns like Weed Patch and Wilkerson that most people outside California have never heard of. South of the border in Baja California, a related cluster near Santa Isabel and Progreso has been producing multiple small earthquakes almost daily, magnitude 1. 5 to 2. 8 in the same broader tectonic zone that connects into California's own fault network along the U.S.-Mexico border. None of these individual tremors made international news. None of them collapsed a building. But that is exactly why so few people are paying attention, and that is exactly the problem. Consider what the state's own long-term seismic hazard assessments already say, in plain language, about the ground beneath its 2 largest metropolitan regions. California faces the highest earthquake risk of any state in the country, sitting directly atop the boundary between the Pacific Plate and the North American Plate. The San Andreas Fault system alone runs roughly 1,200 kilometers through the state, threading beneath or beside dozens of towns and cities most residents pass through without a second thought. Peak ground acceleration in some of the most exposed zones, directly atop fault traces in cities like Oakland and Fremont, has been modeled at levels among the highest recorded anywhere in California. This is not speculative language from an alarmist source. This is the baseline hazard assessment that engineers, insurers, and emergency planners already use to make real decisions about where hospitals, schools, and water systems can safely be built. Most people are missing this. A magnitude 2 or magnitude 3 earthquake feels like nothing, maybe a passing truck, maybe nothing at all. But seismologists do not look at individual earthquakes in isolation. They look at patterns, at clusters, at whether stress along a fault system is building or releasing. And in California right now, there's a pattern that has quietly worried scientists for years, one that has nothing to do with Japan at all, and everything to do with a fault line most Californians drive across every single day without realizing it. It is called the Hayward Fault. It runs 74 miles through the East Bay, cutting directly beneath Oakland, Berkeley, Fremont, and Livermore, slicing through neighborhoods, hospitals, and university campuses along the way. It is part of the larger San Andreas Fault system, and the United States Geological Survey has publicly described it as a tectonic time bomb. That is not this script exaggerating. That is the actual language used by USGS scientists in their own published materials. The Hayward Fault typically ruptures on a cycle of roughly 95 to 183 years. Its last major rupture was in 1868, a magnitude 6, 8 to 7. Zero event that devastated the region when the Bay Area was still a fraction of its current size. That means 158 years have now passed since the last major release of stress on this fault, placing it at or beyond its typical historical cycle. But that is not the real story, not by itself. In April of this year, researchers at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory and Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory published new three-dimensional simulations of what a magnitude 7 zero rupture on the Hayward Fault would actually look like today. They ran 50 separate scenarios. What they found was worse than earlier models predicted. Ground shaking in some areas could be up to 50% stronger than previously estimated, because the deep geological basins and shoreline mud deposits beneath cities like Oakland and Berkeley act almost like a lens, focusing seismic energy directly into some of the most densely populated ground in California. Nearly 8 million people live in the Bay Area today. The federal Hayward scenario, built specifically to model this exact fault, estimates that a magnitude 7 zero rupture could cause hundreds of deaths, leave thousands homeless, and cripple the regional economy for years. The official 2014 to 2043 earthquake outlook for the San Francisco Bay region puts the probability of a magnitude 6, 7 or greater earthquake somewhere in the region at 72% before 2043. Now the focus shifts to what that actually means for the people living there right now. The BART Transbay Tube, the underwater rail crossing connecting San Francisco and Oakland, carries roughly 450,000 passengers a day through a tunnel that sits directly across both the Hayward and San Andreas Fault systems. The Hetchy Aqueduct, which supplies 85% of San Francisco's drinking water, crosses these same fault lines at multiple points along its route from the Sierra Nevada. The Port of Oakland, the fifth busiest container port in the United States, sits on artificial fill soil that is highly vulnerable to liquefaction. The process where saturated ground essentially turns to liquid during strong shaking, swallowing the stability beneath roads, pipelines, and building foundations. This is not a hypothetical port in some faraway country. This is infrastructure that millions of people rely on every single day, without thinking twice about what is running underneath it. And this is where it becomes dangerous for people who do not live anywhere near the Bay Area too. Zoom out from Oakland and look at the entire state. California sits on the boundary between the Pacific Plate and the North American Plate, and it carries what scientists consider the highest overall earthquake risk of any state in the country. The San Andreas Fault alone stretches roughly 800 miles through California, cutting through some of the most populated regions on Earth. Statewide seismic modeling puts the probability of a magnitude 6, 7 or greater earthquake somewhere in California at extremely high levels within the next 30 years. And Los Angeles County alone has 10 million residents living within 50 kilometers of at least 3 separate faults capable of producing a magnitude 7, 0 or larger earthquake. 16 million people and an estimated $3 trillion in building value across the state currently sit inside zones classified as extreme seismic hazard areas. One more thing you need to know, because this is the part that gets misunderstood every single time something like this happens. In the days after the Kumamoto earthquake, and after that Redwood Valley sequence began, and after separate earthquakes struck Venezuela around the same window of time, a wave of online speculation followed, asking whether these events were somehow connected, whether the planet itself was becoming more dangerous all at once. Seismologists have answered this question directly, and they are clear about it. Japan and California both sit along the Pacific Ring of Fire, a roughly 40,000-kilometer horseshoe-shaped belt of fault lines and volcanoes that circles almost the entire Pacific Ocean and produces the vast majority of the world's earthquakes. But sitting on the same ring does not mean one earthquake causes another thousands of miles away. Scientists who study this have said plainly that an earthquake in Japan does not trigger an earthquake in California. The distances involved are simply too great for that kind of direct mechanical link. What connects them is not cause and effect. What connects them is that both regions sit on some of the most stressed, most active tectonic boundaries on the entire planet, independently, and both are capable of producing devastating earthquakes without any need for the other to move first. That is actually the more unsettling version of the truth, not the less unsettling one, because it means Kumamoto's tragedy and California's quiet earthquake swarm are not a single storyline building towards some coordinated event. They are two completely separate, unrelated reminders that the ground beneath heavily populated regions on opposite sides of the Pacific can fail without warning, on its own timeline, for its own reasons, regardless of what is happening anywhere else in the world. Here is why this is serious for the people reading this right now. Earthquakes do not wait for convenient timing. The 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake, magnitude 6. 9 struck the Bay Area during rush hour during a World Series game being broadcast live to the entire country, and still killed 63 people, collapsing a section of the Nimitz Freeway and a portion of the Bay Bridge in an instant. The 1994 Northridge earthquake in Los Angeles, magnitude 6. 7 struck at 4:31 in the morning while people were asleep in their beds, killed 57 people, and caused roughly $20 billion in damage in a matter of seconds. And further back, the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, estimated near magnitude 7, 9, killed an estimated 3,000 people, most of them not from the shaking itself, but from the fires that swept through the city afterward because water mains had ruptured and firefighters had nothing to fight the flames with. Every single one of these events happened without a countdown. No alarm sounded days in advance. People went to sleep in a normal city and woke up, if they woke up at all, in a different one. Think about what that actually means for families living across California right now. Parents asleep at 2 in the morning with children down the hall. Power grids that could go dark across entire counties in an instant. Roads that could crack, buckle, or flood from ruptured water mains, cutting off entire neighborhoods from emergency responders. Farmers across the Central Valley whose irrigation systems and packing facilities sit directly across active fault zones, capable of losing an entire season's crop if infrastructure fails at the wrong moment. Hospitals built decades ago, some still not fully retrofitted, that would need to keep functioning through the exact moment they are needed most. This is not abstract risk modeling for people who study earthquakes in a lab. This is the daily, unspoken backdrop for tens of millions of people who live, work, and raise families across one of the most seismically loaded landscapes on the planet. Think about what a single major rupture does to the ordinary rhythm of daily life in a region like this. Grocery store shelves empty within hours as people stock up on water and batteries they should have bought months earlier. Freeway overpasses, some retrofitted, some still waiting on funding that has been delayed for years, become choke points that determine whether ambulances can even reach the neighborhoods that need them. Cell networks overload within minutes, as everyone tries to call the same handful of people at the same time. Schools become emergency shelters overnight, and parents who were at work when the shaking started spend the following hours trying to reach children who are, in most cases, perfectly safe but completely unreachable by phone. None of this requires a worst-case magnitude 8 event, a well-placed magnitude 6. 5 in the wrong location at the wrong time of day is enough to trigger every one of these consequences at once. But that is not the real story. Cities along the Hayward Fault, including Oakland, Berkeley, and Hayward, have adopted retrofit ordinances specifically targeting soft-story apartment buildings and unreinforced masonry structures, the two building types most likely to fail catastrophically in strong shaking. California maintains the ShakeAlert early warning system, the same system that activated during the Redwood Valley sequence, capable of giving residents seconds to tens of seconds of warning before shaking arrives. Enough time in some cases to stop a train, open firehouse doors, or simply get away from a window. California has some of the strictest seismic building codes in the world. None of that eliminates the risk. But it does mean that what happens next depends heavily on choices made long before the shaking starts. Choices about retrofitting, about emergency planning, about whether a household actually knows what to do in the first 10 seconds of a ShakeAlert notification instead of the first 10 seconds of shaking itself. And now it gets worse in one specific way that deserves attention before this video ends. The scientists behind the April study on the Hayward Fault were careful to note something important. Their updated model, showing ground motion up to 50% stronger than earlier assumptions, was calibrated against current population density and modern development patterns across the East Bay, not against the smaller, less developed region that existed decades ago when older models were built. In other words, the danger has not stayed flat while the population grew around it. The infrastructure exposed to a major Hayward rupture today is larger, denser, and in many ways more complicated than anything California's emergency planners were originally designing around. Every high-rise built in the last 20 years, every new transit line, every additional lane of freeway threading through the East Bay adds more at stake the day this fault finally lets go. This is where it becomes dangerous in a way that connects directly back to what just happened in Japan, not because the two events are mechanically linked, but because Kumamoto is a live demonstration of exactly what modern seismic risk looks like when it arrives without enough warning. A modern, developed, well-prepared country still watched a shopping mall collapse with people inside. Still watched a death toll climb for 6 straight days as heat and aftershocks compounded the original disaster. Still watched a fault zone rupture in a way that surprised scientists who had studied it for years. Japan has some of the most advanced earthquake engineering on the planet, and Kumamoto still happened exactly the way it happened. That is the warning worth paying attention to, not because California and Japan share a hidden connection under the ocean floor, but because they share the same category of risk, the same order of magnitude of consequence, and in the Bay Area's case, a fault that scientists have been calling overdue for years. What happened next in Kumamoto changed the timeline for how officials are now thinking about evacuation planning, heat response during disaster recovery, and how quickly they moved displaced residents out of cars and into shelters after future events. Japanese officials, in the days following the quake, shifted urgently toward what they called secondary evacuation, moving survivors out of vehicles and makeshift shelters and into safer, cooler locations, as the heat wave compounded the disaster's toll. That is a lesson written in real time this week, not from a textbook. And it is a lesson that applies directly to California, where a major earthquake striking during a heat wave, during wildfire season, or during any other overlapping emergency could create exactly the kind of layered crisis that turned a survivable earthquake in Kumamoto into a slower-moving humanitarian emergency over the days that followed. This next part matters just as much as anything already covered here. The swarm of earthquakes near Redwood Valley has not stopped. Over 230 events, and counting in that sequence alone, a number that continues to grow as seismic networks keep logging aftershocks in the region. Meanwhile, activity in the southern part of the state, around the Kern County towns near Weedpatch and Wilkerson, continues at a lower but steady pace, the kind of background seismicity that rarely makes headlines but never actually goes away. California recorded roughly 500 earthquakes of magnitude 2, 5 or higher so far this year, a reminder that the ground beneath the state's freeways, schools, and neighborhoods is in near constant, mostly invisible motion. Scientists do not read small earthquakes as proof that a larger one is imminent. There's no reliable way to predict the exact day or hour a major fault will rupture. Not in California, not in Japan, not anywhere. But scientists do read patterns of ongoing seismicity as confirmation that these fault systems remain fully active, fully loaded, and fully capable of producing a damaging event without additional warning beyond what ShakeAlert can provide in the final seconds. Here is why this matters beyond the Bay Area specifically. Southern California carries its own version of this exact risk, independent of anything happening up north. The San Andreas Fault's southern segment, running through the Coachella Valley and into the Los Angeles Basin, has not experienced a major rupture in longer than its own historical average cycle either. Scientists studying this southern section have raised similar concerns for years, describing sections of it as locked and loaded, storing stress that has not been released in centuries in some segments. Combine that with the sheer population density of greater Los Angeles, home to well over 10 million people directly, and the math becomes difficult to look away from. This is not one city with one fault. This is an entire state built directly across one of the most active plate boundaries on the planet, with 2 of the largest, most economically critical metropolitan regions in the country sitting almost directly on top of it. Look back at what happened the last time a major Southern California fault let go without warning. The 1994 Northridge earthquake struck at 4:31 in the morning, catching an entire region asleep. Freeway overpasses collapsed onto the roadways beneath them. Apartment buildings pancaked floor into floor. 57 people died, and the region absorbed roughly $20 billion in damage. At the time, one of the costliest natural disasters in United States history, all from a fault segment many residents did not even know existed until the ground moved. Los Angeles has grown enormously since 1994. More people, more high-rises, more critical infrastructure threading through the same basin, sitting across the same network of faults that has not gone anywhere and has not stopped accumulating stress in the 3 decades since. There is also a seasonal layer to this that rarely gets mentioned. California's earthquake risk does not pause for wildfire season, and wildfire season does not pause for earthquakes. In major ruptures striking during the late summer or fall, when much of the state is already under red flag fire warnings, dry vegetation, and strained utility crews, could easily produce ruptured gas lines and downed power infrastructure at the exact moment firefighting resources are already stretched thin across multiple active fires elsewhere in the state. Emergency planners have modeled these overlapping disaster scenarios for years precisely because the timing lines up more often than people assume. August, September, and October are peak fire months in California, and they sit squarely inside the same calendar window when many of the state's largest historical earthquakes have occurred. Most people are missing one more piece of this too. Earthquake insurance in California is not automatically included in most standard homeowners or renters policies. And separate earthquake coverage, while available, is something a large share of California residents simply do not carry, often because of cost or because the risk feels distant until the moment it suddenly is not. When the ground shifts, and it eventually will along one of these systems, the financial impact for uninsured families can be just as devastating as the physical damage itself, stretching recovery out for years in ways that rarely make it into the news coverage once the initial disaster fades from headlines. Statewide seismic hazard assessments put an estimated $3 trillion in building value inside California's highest risk zones, spread across 16 million residents. That is not a number that disappears quietly. It is a number that eventually gets paid by homeowners, by insurers, by state and federal disaster funds, or by families who simply absorb the loss because no other option exists. And history shows that the bill almost always lands hardest on the households that could least afford to plan ahead of time. We will know more about the Kumamoto recovery in the days ahead as rescue teams finish clearing the collapsed mall site and officials finalize casualty counts. But right now, the death toll there is still being revised upward, and the region is still under active aftershock warnings, with authorities cautioning residents that further strong shaking remains possible in the coming days. On the other side of the Pacific, the Redwood Valley sequence in Northern California continues to generate new events, and seismologists continue to monitor whether this activity represents a temporary release of stress or the leading edge of something larger still building beneath the surface. Neither of these situations has a defined ending yet. Neither one comes with a scheduled resolution. The atmosphere of attention around all of this tends to fade fast. Kumamoto will eventually drop out of global headlines, replaced by whatever the next urgent story becomes. And the earthquake swarm quietly moving through Northern California will likely never receive anywhere close to the same level of coverage, despite sitting directly beneath millions of people and directly astride a fault system that federal scientists have already labeled overdue and potentially catastrophic. That gap between how much attention an event receives and how much actual risk it represents is exactly where most people get caught off guard. The cameras were on Japan this week. They were not on the Hayward Fault. They were not on Redwood Valley. And they were not on the quiet, steady drumbeat of small earthquakes rippling through the Central Valley toward Kern County. But the ground does not require an audience to keep moving. The next several days could reveal whether the Redwood Valley sequence is winding down or building towards something larger, and whether Kumamoto's aftershock activity is fully settled or has more ahead of it. Both situations remain open right now, being tracked in real time by the same networks of seismologists who have spent years warning that California's overdue faults will not send a warning of their own before they finally move. This story is still developing on both sides of the Pacific tonight, and for the millions of people living across California's fault lines, the ground beneath them is not finished deciding what happens next. Officials in Kumamoto Prefecture say search and rescue operations around the collapsed mall site remain active, with crews continuing to work through the wreckage as families wait for word on those still unaccounted for. Emergency shelters across the prefecture remain open, and the shift toward secondary evacuation, moving people out of cars and into cooler, safer facilities, continues as the heat wave shows no sign of breaking. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Pacific, seismic monitoring stations across northern and southern California continue logging events by the hour, part of the same restless, ongoing motion that has defined the state's geology for millions of years and will keep defining it long after this particular news cycle fades. Nobody, not USGS scientists, not the researchers behind the Hayward Fault simulations, not anyone monitoring the Redwood Valley sequence in real time, can say exactly when the next major rupture arrives. What they can say, clearly and repeatedly, is that it is not a matter of if. The fault is there. The stress is there. The overdue window has already opened. The only unknown left is the date, and dates like that do not send advance notice.